Let's look into some of the trends that are going on today, and some of the things that we're actually facing. So some of our insights. As we look at the epidemiology of addiction in general, but also with our older population, illicit drug use typically declines after young adulthood. That's what you expect. Yet there are nearly 1 million adults aged 65 and older with substance use disorders. That was reported in 2018, and I'm sure it's much higher than that now because of the fentanyl crisis. And so you would think that substance abuse would always decline. It does not always decline because we have such availability of medications, even to the elderly. So with the total number of substance use disorder admissions into treatment facilities between 2000 and 2012 differed slightly. From 2012 till now, it has gone up remarkably from 3.4%. I would beg to differ, up to 10%, if not more. And so we've seen this from 2000 to 2012 for 12 years, fairly stagnant, about the same. 2012 until today, quite a bit higher. And this is what really calls for the need for us to address the topic. Question for you then: are older adults impacted differently by alcohol and substances? Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you put in the chat there, what are some ways that you've seen substances affect elderly people in ways that may not be the same in a younger population? What are some of the differences between the elderly and younger population? So what we see happening is there's a vulnerability. So cognition, memory loss, cognition, but they're vulnerable in the situation because of their aging brains and their aging bodies. We don't know enough about the effects of drugs and alcohol on the aging brain, but what looks like we all agree is brain fog and memory loss, lack of cognition. The liver's not able to metabolize like it used to. Absolutely. Financial issues, memories decrease. So older adults typically metabolize substances slower, so their brains are more sensitive to the drugs, whether it's alcohol or substances. As their metabolism slows down, so does their ability to metabolize a substance, which will make them use more, possibly, to get the same effect, because it's not tolerance, it's actually the ability to break down the substance. So let's talk about some historic people. So we have our pre-baby boomers. And this would be people that were born before World War II. They're more likely to have moralistic values and attitudes about drinking and drug use. My parents, for example, were very moralistic about any substance abuse. But for example, my father came back from the Korean War, and he had severe PTSD. He had become addicted to Darvocet, which is a form of it was called Darvon back then. He became addicted to that for the pain that he was in. He had horrible nightmares and tremors. There were certain movies we couldn't watch in our home because they would trigger him, but we didn't know what to call it back then. We didn't have neither an assessment, we didn't have a diagnosis, we didn't have a treatment for it back then. And so we had no idea where to go with it. In his particular case, for example, he was very moralistic about alcohol. He demonized alcohol, and anybody that drank was a horrible person to him. And yet, in the closet, he was addicted to Darvon, this Darvocet, and it was prescribed. He would get these large bottles of the medications and take them, and then every once in a while, he would decide he was going to quit using it, and that made a bad week or a couple of weeks for all of us. So there is a difference in the pre-baby boomer generation because they felt ashamed. There would be a sense of shame with their substance use. They would attribute their substance use to a moral failure. They might be less likely to seek help because they're embarrassed. And so, it's harder for them to actually bring that out and talk about it. And then this cohort, they're likelier to benefit from screening and brief interventions in the healthcare area and with provider if it's not an approach of moral value, but rather one of the two questions we asked before. How does it affect your quality of life? You know, how well is it helping you, or is it harming you? Those are the key questions for that. But in that particular generation, what was happening is in the early 50s, we found the movement, the AA movement, come on board, which almost seemed to really, it seemed to back and reinforce the entire morality value of substance use and the shaming of it in many areas. And so it fit well for that generation because they already had a value, a morality towards substance use. And then they had a movement of peer support back then that also kind of worked with that. And in conjunction, many people got sober from it, but it was still a moralistic value. When I interview young people today who are in their 20s and even 30s, they're not looking for that. They're not happy with the whole concept of, you know, shaming and that sort of thing. Matter of fact, in our treatment center, we never tell anyone they're an alcoholic. We let them discover for themselves what their consequences are and what their complications are from substance use. And we have tools and instruments we'll look at later to help them discover that. But we're not telling them that. Whereas in old school, you know, you had to say you were an alcoholic. You know, you had to come on, you got to come clean now. You got to say you're an alcoholic. Every time you talk, you got to say, hey, I'm Paul, I'm an alcoholic. Younger people today will run from that. They will fight that. And so what we've trained our people to do in our programs that seems to be working very well is we'll say, hi, I'm Paul. I'm grateful in my recovery from drugs and alcohol. So I'm Bill. I'm grateful for my recovery from an episode of over drinking. I'm Gary. I'm grateful for my recovery from a DUI and learning not to drink. So rather than having to come out and say it, now I'm aware that many people would say if you don't say you're an alcoholic, then you are an alcoholic and you are not acknowledging it. But if we can soften the blow for people to the point in the younger generations that they can move into recovery and move into a recovery where they're not being shamed by it. For the pre-boomer, that was a good fit for them. You know, they're like, yeah, sure, I feel bad, I feel shamed. You know, then what happened was the baby boomers, which would be my generation, and I'm in my 60s. I know you don't believe it, but I am. And so when the baby boomers came along, people who were born between 1946 and 64, that they grew up in a time when it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so substance use was acceptable. It was just widespread. I mean, I live in Virginia Beach, and in the 70s, we were all using anything we could find. Whatever substances were available, that's what we would use. When harder drugs came along towards the end of the middle to the end of the 70s, that's when things started changing in our locality, because we had people that started getting hooked on cocaine and on heroin. And so that really changed the playing field. But until then, you know, we had some amphetamines, but mostly marijuana, you know, some of the lighter drugs, if you want to call it that. But it was acceptable. Everybody was getting high according to our culture. It's kind of what dictated it. You know, I think a good study is to think about what drug was available with each generation. You know, there were some generations, you think of, you know, in the 70s when you had your Studio 54 and ecstasy became a big deal. You know, in the 80s, it was ecstasy. Heroin then, you know, became widespread in parts of our country. And now we have fentanyl. I was just in New Bern, North Carolina, in this little tiny town. It's a beautiful place, visiting my youngest brother, and overheard my uncle and my cousin talking, and I heard the word trank in their conversation. I said, you mind my asking, did you just say something about trank? And my cousin said, yeah, we've got trank here in New Bern. Trank is a combination of horse tranquilizer with fentanyl, and sometimes they'll throw a little bit of battery acid in there, and they'll throw a little bit of grease in there, all kinds of different, and it makes people's skin fall off. They'll get big ulcers, and they'll bend over halfway and can't stand back up, and they'll stay in that position for hours, and they call it trank because they're tranquilized. But so what happened with the baby boomers is they just kind of used whatever they could get. And it was a cultural thing. It was okay. It was good. You know, Cheech and Chong and the whole, that whole cultural movement of substance use. They're more permissive in their attitudes about drinking and more permissive about marijuana or other substances. They're also very likely to be willing to seek and agree to specialized treatment when they see the need for it and that things have gone wrong. And so when they're aware of it, treatment's not such a turnoff to them as it would be for the pre-baby boomers. They're not as concerned about getting help and that sort of thing.